The geometry of your sleeping mind. It started with a triangle. Nothing unusual, just a shape that hovered at the edge of sleep, faint as smoke, gone before she could name it. Dr. Miriam Cole had been studying sleep paralysis for 11 years. She had documented 300 cases, catalogued 417 anomalies, and never once considered that geometry could be a language. The second night, there were 2 triangles, the third, 4. By the end of the first week, she was waking at 3 a.m. to sketch them in a notebook kept on her nightstand, not because she feared forgetting them, but because her hands seemed to require it. Urgent, compulsive, a need she didn't understand. The shapes were not abstract. They were precise. They arrived with dimensions. They arrived with angles she could measure, and when she measured them, the numbers were always the same. She told herself it was stress, but stress does not repeat with mathematical precision. By the third week, she had filled 6 notebooks. By the fourth, she had recognized patterns. Not patterns like wallpaper or music, but patterns like language, recursive, layered, contextual, the same symbol appearing in different arrangements, meaning different things, or perhaps meaning the same thing in ways she couldn't yet parse. She had begun to understand that whatever was leaving these shapes in her mind was not communicating to her. It was communicating through the act of her observation. She was not the reader. She was the page. She shared the notebooks with her colleague Dr. Fenn, a steady man, the kind who needed evidence before he changed his mind. He studied her sketches for a long time, turning them slowly, saying nothing. That evening he called her from his car. "Miriam," he said, "I've seen 3 of these before." She asked him where. He said, "In the autopsy photographs, the subjects from the deep sky anomaly study, the ones who stopped sleeping altogether." There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "I think you should come in tomorrow." She said she would. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was afraid, because she was no longer tired. The absence of sleep was not unpleasant. It was clarifying, like living behind frosted glass and having someone finally wipe it clean. She perceived the edges of objects with new sharpness. She noticed that shadows in her office fell at angles that did not align with their light sources, and when she measured them, they all pointed in the same direction. Not toward the window, not toward the floor lamp, but toward a fixed point somewhere beyond the eastern wall. She began measuring the angles each morning. They were consistent to the millimeter. They were narrowing. Something was approaching from a direction that had no name in standard geometry. Dr. Fenn disappeared on a Tuesday. His apartment was found empty, not ransacked, not abandoned in haste, but empty in the way of a space that had been carefully and thoroughly unmade. All surfaces clean. No personal effects. No indication that a person had ever arranged themselves there. His car sat in the university lot for 6 days. The police found no leads. The following week, Miriam found his last notebook in her mailbox, stuffed in a plain envelope with no postage, no return address. Inside the cover, in his handwriting, 4 words: "You are not dreaming." She set the notebook on her desk and looked at it for a long time. Then she opened it. The contents were not in any language she recognized, but she could read them. That was the part that should have frightened her more than it did. Not that the text was alien, but that comprehension arrived the way memory arrives. Not learned, but remembered, accessed. The notebook described a topology, a structure that existed not in space but in the framework that space was embedded within. It described entities, Not creatures, not minds in any sense she had vocabulary for, but processes. Vast iterative functions calculating in base 12 mathematics across timescales that made geological time look like an afternoon. And it described what they were calculating. They were calculating us. Not humanity, not any individual or civilization, but the architecture of consciousness itself. Every mind that had ever developed the capacity for abstract geometric reasoning was a variable in the output, a single, impossibly layered shape being refined over deep time, each thinking creature adding precision to a value that kept approaching something without ever arriving. The notebook called that asymptoto, in the only human word that fit. A name. They were computing a name. We were the letters, E. The entities did not want to communicate with us. We were not the audience. We were the sentence. Miriam sat in her office long after dark. She did not turn on the lights. In the darkness, she could see, truly see, the geometry of the room, not the physical surfaces and furniture, but the underlying relational structure that gave those things meaning. And in that framework, she could see herself clearly, a point of light, a variable, a part of something being calculated with enormous patience by something she would never be able to look at directly. She could see the direction the calculation was moving. She could see how many letters remained. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked up a pen instead. She opened a blank notebook. The shapes began arriving, not from memory, not from imagination, but from something she could only describe as dictation. Each one a syllable, each syllable part of something longer than any sentence spoken in any language that had ever been spoken by a mouth. She drew steadily, in the dark, and her hand felt less like her own with each page. She was not alarmed. She was, for the first time in her life, certain she was doing exactly what she had been made to do. By morning, 7 notebooks were full. The shapes were beautiful. She could not stop. No one came to find her. The department assumed she had taken leave. Security footage showed her arriving each evening and never leaving. 42 consecutive nights, alone in her office, drawing. On the 42nd night, the footage showed something enter at 3:17 a.m., not through a door, not through a window. The footage degraded at that point. Warped, the technicians said, by a magnetic anomaly they couldn't source. When it cleared 2 minutes later, Miriam was gone. Her notebooks remained, stacked neatly on her desk, every page full. The last line of the last page, in her handwriting, read, "The name is finished. I was the last letter." If you find yourself dreaming in shapes you cannot name, in angles that have no counterpart in waking geometry, you may want to consider what language you are learning and whether you chose to learn it. Some of us were always going to be found. The shapes were never a message. They were an address. Subscribe to Storytime Scary Dark for more tales from the spaces beyond what we were meant to understand.